During this video presentation, I'll be going through ethical, legal, and health and safety issues in sport and exercise science research. So first, just going to go through a bit of key terms and background history. So firstly, what does ethical and legal mean? So ethical is pretty much the moral principles that a person should base their behaviour around and should follow with respect. So it's kind of considered what is right and wrong, not things that have been written down, but what people view in society as just generally being right and wrong. An example of ethics when completed in research is everyone involved in the study should be treated equally. And obviously legal very simply means that the law is saying what the law is saying is right and wrong. So there are laws in place in society that people have to follow, otherwise they can face punishments. So for example, in research it is against the law to not complete a risk assessment, and it will also be breaking the law if you go against the Data Protection Act. So some historical context of when ethical and legal issues started to be put together. Was it all beginning after the actions of the Nazis in World War II? So the Nazis conducted horrifying experiments on people that were not willing, and they were torturing them in order to get results to help improve their army. So some names of the experiments were mustard gas experiments and bone, muscle and nerve transplantation experiments. So it was all really nasty, torturous experiments. All of these experiments went against the ethical and legal principles, as none of the subjects were willing to take part, and there was also mass amounts of psychological and physical harm caused on people. At the time though, there was no law in place to prevent any of this from happening, so in the Nazis' eyes they were doing what they thought was right, and there was nothing that could stop them. However, after World War II, people reflected on the way Nazis treated people and put together a code called the Nuremberg Code to stop any experiments like what the Nazis did to ever happen again. So in 1947, the Nuremberg Code was created, which put 10 points which must be complied with before experimentation is done. So the main outcomes of these points were that all subjects must be volunteers. Studies are necessary and based on good science. So in other words, the studies must have a reasonable purpose to them. They can't be random. Benefits must outweigh the risks. So the benefits of the research, if it's got quite a high risk, it should have a real high importance in order for it to be completed, and participants must have the right to withdraw, and finally the experiment must be conducted by a qualified researcher. So the person running the research must be correctly qualified in order to do any tests or whatever they need to do as part of that research. After the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki was put in place. The Declaration of Helsinki, which was created in 1964 by the WMA. The Declaration of Helsinki is a set of ethical principles regarding human experimentation developed for the medical community by the World Medical Association. The Declaration of Helsinki is like the Nuremberg Code in terms of what it states. This is because it also states that it is essential to be volunteered. The benefits should outweigh the risks, and that no physical or psychological harm should be caused to any client throughout the tests. Finally then, BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. The role of BASES is to produce a code of conduct for sport and exercise science practitioners and researchers. The Code of Conduct outlines ethical and legal issues that are essential to safe research within sport and exercise science. Sports scientists can be given a BASES accreditation, which basically labels them as a researcher that follows the ethical and legal codes set by BASES. Pretty much it helps to boost their credibility as a researcher and makes them appear more professional. However, if they don't follow the ethical and legal codes set by BASES, then they could be called before a tribunal, which is of BASES officers, who could temporarily or permanently suspend them or strip them of their accreditation. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be going through the 3 different system scenarios and identifying good and bad practice in terms of ethical and legal principles in the research. So this is scenario 1. So the evaluation of scenario 1. So the 2 bits of good practice that I can identify from the scenario 1 is that the researcher has informed consent to complete the test, and also they have the appropriate qualification. Having the appropriate qualification as a researcher isn't one of the most crucial things, but it can make them appear a lot more professional because it shows that they know what they'll be doing. Additionally, it shows that they'll be doing something meaningful with the results as part of some scientific research, which avoids any suspicion over why the test might be being completed. If you can remember, this was one of the points of the Nuremberg Code. So secondly, having informed consent is an ethical and legal requirement of research. Therefore, this kind of clearly proves how important it is, because if it isn't completed, then the researcher will very simply be breaking the law. The informed consent can be a verbal discussion, but it's much safer if it's a written document that can be signed for proof that it was completed. Unfortunately, this bit of research is consisted of multiple bits of poor practice. Firstly, there is no evidence to prove that the subject in the research were volunteers. All subjects within a bit of research should always be volunteers. A researcher shouldn't bribe or force anyone into doing any research, because this is extremely unethical. The consequence of the researcher not having his subjects as volunteers are they might not receive ethical training. They might need to receive ethical training, before being allowed to do any further research. So if they force people into doing research and this is reported, they may be told they need to do some ethical training before they can do any future research, just to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Additionally, if they force the subjects to take part, this could do serious damage to their credibility as a researcher due to the levels of unethicality. Obviously as well, won't forget to mention that volunteer was another key point as part of the Nuremberg Code, which was obviously put together after the horrifying actions of the Nazis, where all of the people they tested on were definitely not volunteers. So that kind of shows also the importance and how seriously it must be taken. So secondly, the researcher isn't confidential over the participants' results. All data that is collected from any part of research should be stored away safely in a locked filing cabinet or password protected computer file, meaning that only the researcher or the research supervisor can access it. Additionally, under the Data Protection Act, no data that makes the participants personally identifiable should be included in the research project. This is only allowed if the subject gives you permission to do so. In this particular situation, the client goes against the Data Protection Act and shares all the results of the tests on a whiteboard for everyone to see. Moreover, the test scores were the participants' body fat scores, which is obviously very personal data. As a result of the researcher's poor practice, it could cause significant psychological harm on the participants, due to the fact that the personal data was shared for everybody to see. Additionally, the consequences for the researcher are that they could put themselves at a risk of formal reprimand, such as suspension, but would definitely need ethical training and would most likely lose credibility as a researcher. for being for breaking the act and sharing some really personal data. Additionally, they could have their BASES accreditation terminated for not following their ethical and legal rules. As a result of this, they may be permitted from being able to do any further research, but it usually just means that the researcher won't look as professional and certified. The third bit of bad practice that I picked out from this study is that the researcher didn't give the participants a right to withdraw when they showed signs of reluctancy. Instead, he just ignored the situation and insisted that they were to carry on. The right to withdraw is a huge element within research ethic guidelines. It was one of the key points in the Nuremberg Code, which was obviously created after the horrific actions of the Nazis in World War II. This shows how serious the right to withdraw principle is. A participant might want to withdraw due to feelings of physical or psychological pain. So as a researcher, forcing them to carry on is highly unethical and outright wrong. No matter what the situation is, a researcher must always grant a participant to the right to withdraw. The consequences on the participant from not given the right to withdraw could be further psychological or physical damage, depending on what their situation is. It could also make them feel really uncomfortable or threatened, especially in this situation, because it's a group of 10 to 16-year-olds. This means they will probably become quite vulnerable and wouldn't know what to do when they are told they have to carry on, even if they're feeling psychological or physical pain. Finally, the consequences on the research are that they will most definitely need ethical training. They will most likely be called in front of a tribunal where they would face multiple consequences, like possibly a fine, a written warning, and temporary or permanent suspension, expulsion from BASES. This means that the sports scientists can no longer be able to conduct research on people, or it can make them appear not as professional or accredited. The final bit of poor practice is no subject preparation. So preparation is similar to informed consent because it involves the researcher going over with the participants or participant what they will be doing during the test. Subject preparation should always be done before a test is started, as a way of informing and preparing the clients one more time for what they will be doing and what he will expect from them during the test. It always allows for clients to withdraw if they have second thoughts about doing the test after hearing what they will be expected to do. This is especially important in this scenario because the kids wouldn't have signed the informed consent. The parents had to because they aren't classed as adults yet. This means that they might not know all the specific details and what they will be doing in the test. Therefore, this making client prep even more important before the test is completed. It's important to note that when with adults, this usually would be uncommon because the researcher would go through what they would expect the client to do during the informed consent stage. If the client doesn't like the sound of it, then they won't sign the consent form. But anyway, in this specific scenario, the researcher doesn't complete subject preparation, as when they arrive he tells them they must get changed into swimsuits. What he should do is talk to all clients and explain to them that for this test they will need to be wearing swimsuits. This will ensure that they are prepared for the upcoming test. Telling them they have to get changed is really unethical. It could also make the clients feel quite vulnerable and threatened from being told they have to do something. They would most likely feel too scared to step forward and say no due to being of such a young age. A consequence for the researcher for not completing the subject preparation would be needing to receive ethical training because they didn't follow a really important ethical part of the test. They may also be a subject to a tribunal to review the situation and to be given a warning. Not only is it not telling the participants they have to wear swimwear not subject permission, but it is also deception by omission. Deception by omission is when you leave something out and don't make a participant aware of something that will be going on in the test. This is extremely unethical and kind of naughty of the researcher because it's taking advantage of the people